Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tuesday topic. Today's topic is Race in Admissions Matters, Confronting Clarence Thomas's Diversity Doubts, with our guest speaker today, J. Darius Green, Director of Retention, Recruitment, and Alumni Engagement. Without any further ado, let me throw it over to J. Darius Green, who is our presenter today. And Darius wants us to start with letting Justice Thomas speak for himself to let us know what his thoughts are to frame the conversation. So let's hear Clarence Thomas, and then I'll throw it over to you, Darius. How's that sound? Here we go.
Mr. Park, I've heard the word diversity quite a few times, and I don't have a clue what it means. It seems to mean everything for everyone. And I'd like you first, you did give some examples in your opening remarks, but I'd like you to give us a specific definition of diversity in the context of the University of North Carolina. And I'd also like you to give us a clear idea of exactly what the educational benefits of diversity at the University of North Carolina would be.
All right, there we go. Good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining today for this very, I would say, a timely Tuesday topic. I know that myself and Darren, and I'm certainly sure others were and are anticipating a decision on this case to come out. I was thinking, wouldn't it be so dramatic if a case or the decision actually came out today? But we can certainly probably expect a decision later this week. But I wanted to start with that video for you to hear what's going to set the tone for the conversation in terms of why race and admissions matters and confronting Clarence Thomas's diversity doubts. I wanted to start with that to sort of frame the conversation today. So a little bit about our agenda. We're going to start with an introduction about myself and also why this matters to me. We'll discuss the specific Students for Fair Admissions v. UNC Chapel Hill. We've already heard Clarence Thomas's diversity doubts, but I'll revisit that. We'll also discuss previous race and admissions cases that have set the precedents for this specific case. Then we'll talk about why diversity or why race and admissions matters, and then the educational benefits of diversity with a video from one of our professors here in CNHP, Dr. Ebony White. And then lastly, hopefully we'll have a conversation in terms of what happens next, not only as we anticipate a decision, but also just a more broader conversation in terms of what universities can also do, whatever the decision might be, but also what larger impact this will have in terms of affirmative action in lots of different cases, not only admissions, but employment, contracts, different things. So a little bit about me, if you can't tell by my Southern accent, I'm from the South, more specifically a place called Ahoskie, North Carolina, which is located in rural northeastern North Carolina. And so this is why this case is important to me personally, and why I'm specifically focusing on the North Carolina case. In North Carolina, Hertford County, currently there are 21,000 people that are in that area. When I was growing up there were a little bit more, but lots of people have left. But as of the 2022 census, there were 21,000 in the county, and 16.3% of residents hold a bachelor's degree. That sort of gives you a framework in terms of the area that I'm from. I attended North Carolina A&T State University, which is for undergrad, but also for my graduate degree. And then in 2021, I received a certificate from the University of Michigan in Leading for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Higher Education certificate. Little bit more, and why this matters to me, I would say professionally, is because all of my life, my professional life, I've had my hand in the admissions and also the recruitment world. I would often joke and say, no one dresses up as like an admission counselor for, Halloween. So we're all in this work, especially when it comes to admissions, but also those of you that are in higher ed, really for the passion and the concern that we have for students and wanting them to have access to higher education. So you see that my work started here at A&T, from all the way from undergrad all the way to graduate school. I worked in the admissions office, making phone calls to prospective students and their families. And then from 2001 rather, to 2003, I served as an admission counselor at the University of Maryland. And I'll let you know why that was important, especially during those specific years. Worked again in admissions at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, back to the University of Maryland, working in student affairs, but more specifically with that, in that role from 2005 to 2019, working specifically with recruitment and retention. And then before my role here at Drexel, I was Dean of Student Services at a community college in North Carolina. So that's specifically why this case matters so much to me, again, professionally, but also personally, because I really do see it as an attack almost on what's happening, not only nationwide, but more specifically in North Carolina. So let's talk now a little bit about the specific case, the Students for Fair Admissions Incorporated, v. UNC at Chapel Hill. So the Students for Fair Admissions was founded in 2014 by Abigail Fisher, her father, and a wealthy investor here in the United States, Edward Bloom. Remember that name, Abigail Fisher. This case specifically centers around a white student who was denied admission to UNC and is a member of the SFFA. I don't believe that the student was ever identified in this specific case. You may also know there's another case that the Supreme Court is also reviewing now, which is from Harvard, which is for an Asian student who was denied admission to Harvard University. So they're reviewing both of these cases together so that you also know on the specific, the Harvard case, Justice Jackson is not a part of that because she serves in a specific board role at Harvard. However, she is expected to make a decision on the UNC case. So in this specific case, the Student for Fair Admissions argues that UNC awards mammoth racial preferences to African Americans and Hispanic applicants to the detriment of white and Asian applicants as well. So, all right. So I wanted to give you a little bit more about the case. Now, let's talk about the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and that specific university. They opened in 1795 as the first public university in the nation to award degrees. Now, if you know, there's lots of back and forth between UNC, but also William and Mary in terms of who was started first, but UNC Chapel Hill was the first to award degrees. UNC at Chapel Hill admitted their first Black students in 1951. This university opened in 1795. The first Black student was admitted to the law school in 1951. Undergraduate was 1955. The medical school was 1955, and they hired their first Black faculty in 1966. Now, I was born in 1977. You all know the year that you were born. So think about that. This is really, this has happened in our lifetime, the lifetime of me and also many of you as well. So something to keep in mind also about the student enrollment at UNC in 2022, they were 9% Black, 56% white, 13% Asian, and 10% Hispanic. Now, keep in mind that the state of North Carolina in 2022 had a Black population of 22%. So a lot of what's happening, not only in this UNC case, but also other cases, especially the larger, more selective public institutions, is that they're saying that a lot of the racial makeup at these schools does not mirror that of the racial makeup in each of the specific states. Something else to consider when it comes to the admissions criteria, specifically in North Carolina, is that in 1986, the UNC system, there's a policy that requires that its universities do not exceed more than 18% out-of-state students in an entering class. So keep that in mind. You've already got a very highly selective public institution, but now the state has also made this mandate that 18% of their students in an entering class cannot be more than out of state. Now, there are some exceptions to that, more specifically with HBCUs. I believe North Carolina A&T and North Carolina Central, two of the larger HBCUs in the state, have a 35% exception there. And then the other three HBCUs, I believe, have a 25% exception. These are fairly new. There are also conversations in the state now to raise that percentage there. But I want to give this backdrop here to say it's already a selective institution already, all right? Now, I wanted to leave this here because I wanted to revisit what Clarence Thomas actually stated in that video there. What he actually stated was, I've heard the word diversity quite a few times, and I don't have a clue what it means. It seems to mean everything for everyone. I'd like you to give a specific definition of diversity in the context of the University of North Carolina. And I'd also like you to give us a clear idea of what the educational benefits of diversity at the University of North Carolina would be. All right. Oh, there we go. All right. Okay. So I wanted to, reiterate what Clarence Thomas's doubts were, but I also want to let you know who Clarence Thomas is. Clarence Thomas was born in 1948 in Pinpoint, Georgia, which is a part of the metropolitan area of Savannah. And I got to thinking about this. Clarence Thomas was also born the same year as my mother. So again, in people that I know, these things have happened in their lifetime. He attended the College of the Holy Cross as an undergraduate in the class of 1971. You should also keep in mind he was a part of the first group of Black men to enroll in 1968. I'm sure there were some affirmative action benefits that Clarence Thomas received with this enrollment. If you want to learn more about that, there's a phenomenal documentary right now, not only on Clarence Thomas, but also on his wife. That's on PBS. It's called Frontline. It's about 2 hours of goodness, I'll say. It's just a great to give a more insight in terms of who Clarence Thomas is, but also his wife as well. So he also graduated from Yale Law School and was a part of the class of 1974. Now, I find it very interesting that someone would have these diversity doubts or has a history of questioning affirmative action. When you look at his professional record, he was the Assistant Secretary of Education for the Office of Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Education. He was nominated by Ronald Reagan for that. He was the chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission from 1982 to 1990. And then he was nominated by George W. Bush to serve as the circuit court judge for the United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, where he served for 1 year before he was nominated by George H.W. Bush to the Supreme Court, where he still serves now, to replace retiring Justice Thurgood Marshall. He was approved by a Senate vote of 52 to 48. We all know how that Senate nomination, went. We don't need to revisit that, but the documentary touched on that a little bit. But if you want to learn more about who Clarence Thomas is, I would certainly refer you to go to PBS, to the Frontline documentary that'll learn a little bit more about the man who is Clarence Thomas. So let's now talk a little bit about some of the previous race and admissions cases that have really got us to where we are today. So we're looking at the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke in 1978. So this was one of the first cases regarding affirmative action in admissions, which was the center of this case. Alan Bakke was a white applicant who was denied admissions twice to the University of California Davis School of Medicine. Now, at that time in 1978, UC Davis used racial quotas, which in essence set aside a number of seats for minority students for their entering class. There were about 16 seats for every 100 students that were coming in. 16 of those seats were set aside for minoritized students, I would say, for the incoming class. And so with that ruling, the Supreme Court in 1978 ruled that racial quotas was unconstitutional. However, they stated that race could be considered amongst other factors in a holistic admission review process. So the quotas, in essence, said that because you're a person of a certain, group, you're in, or we're going to save seats for you. So, but that was quotas were struck down. But let's now fast forward to 2003, where we have Grutter versus Bollinger. Bollinger was the president of the University of Michigan. This is Barbara Grutter, who was a white applicant who was denied admission to the University of Michigan Law School. Grutter claimed that the use of race in admissions violated her rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And in that decision, the Supreme Court allowed the use of race in admissions as a factor to continue to help those universities or to help universities and the University of Michigan achieve a diverse student body that was set in the Bakke case. So in essence, it can continue. However, to note, a very important distinction in that, in the majority ruling, Sandra Day O'Connor stated that the court expects that 25 years from now, the use of racial preferences will no longer be necessary to further the interests of group today. That was 2003. We're 20 years out. So we're very close to this 25 years now. So very similar to what the Supreme Court is doing now in terms of reviewing the Harvard case and the North Carolina case. In 2003, they also reviewed another case at the University of Michigan, which was Gratz versus Bollinger again. But this was where Jennifer Gratz applied and was denied admission as an undergraduate to the University of Michigan in 1995. The University of Michigan at that time used a point system in their admissions review, where they were a 150-point scale with 100 points. If applicants received 100 points, they were in essence guaranteed admissions. Well, the university at the time would automatically grant African-American students, Hispanics, Native Americans, and other minoritized groups an automatic 20 points. So they were giving them an advantage in that. Now, in this, the Supreme Court ruled against the University of Michigan, stating that the point system did actually violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, because at that time, what it didn't do was it did not provide individual consideration for the applicant. It would lump all these groups together to say, because you're in this group, we're giving you this. It's important to note that the University of Michigan itself had two review processes. And so also, I wanted you to make a distinction of the years there is that, remember, I said I was an admission counselor at the University of Maryland from 2001 to 2003. Like the University of Michigan, the University of Maryland is a selective, public institution. We were extremely nervous in that office. As an admission counselor, someone who reviewed applications, the leadership. You should also know that the University of Maryland had maybe in the mid 90s been sued, and they had a case to go to the Supreme Court as well, where they lost that case. That was dealing with scholarships, where the University of Maryland granted scholarships specifically for students of color, Black students, Hispanic students. So they lost that case. So they were already in the mindset of, we've already lost this case. What does this mean? It was nervous times as a reviewer of applicants in 2003, but we forged through. So another case, remember the name I mentioned, Abigail Fisher, who is one of the founders of SFFA. She, in 2016, actually, a lot of these cases happened before. So in 2016, this is when the ruling came, but this specific case here, which the decision was in 2016, this had gone through the courts several times. But in 2016 was when a decision was made. So Abigail Fisher, a white applicant, claimed that she was denied admission in 2008 to the University of Texas based on her race, thus violating her rights under the Equal Protection Clause. The Supreme Court once again upheld race and admissions precedent set in the Grutter versus Bollinger case this time, and certainly affirmed that a holistic review and consideration of race as one of many factors to diversify campuses. Something that's very important for me in all of these cases is that there's sort of a sense that these applicants feel that they have a right to, that this is their space, that someone else is taking my space, this is my seat. And I just find that, very interesting backdrop that I feel, at least, that could be woven within all of these specific cases here. So I wanted to give you a sample of factors in terms of consideration for admissions. I searched all over for what some of those factors would be at the University of North Carolina, but certainly since this case has happened, you can't find a lot of that information. But I've heard that in the oral arguments, at least, which is like 4 hours long, and I sat through and listened to, but they have about 40 different factors that they consider. But I wanted to give you an insight in terms of what some selective universities might consider in a holistic review process. This is from the University of Maryland. This is currently on their website right now. So I'll just highlight some of them. Some of the most important factors that not only Maryland, but also every university is going to consider in an applicant: the high school achievement or the grades in the courses. They want to make sure that you have been a successful high school student and that you've achieved well, because that can be an indicator in terms of how you're going to perform at the specific university. Certainly SAT or ACT scores. Lots of universities are now test optional. Drexel is test optional. University of Maryland is test optional until 2025. UNC Chapel Hill is test optional until 2024. So test scores should be coming back into play here. They also consider socioeconomic background, which a lot of the proponents to end affirmative action in admissions are saying, let's focus more on socioeconomic background. So that's also considered. Their essay, community service, special talents or skills, that can range anywhere from an oboe player to a gymnast or a basketball player. That's a special talent that, one might actually have. Demonstrated leadership, and certainly race is there. But again, let's go back to the residency status. That can come into play again in North Carolina. Are you in state? Are you out of state? So, for example, this is just one example of factors when we talk about what a holistic review process actually is. I will be the first to admit that the admissions process historically has been very secretive. There's a book out called Who Gets In and Why, where I can't think of the author's name right now, but he set in on, for a year, the admission cycle of 3 different institutions. A public institution, I know Emory was one of them. I believe the University of Washington may have been one, and there's another school there. And it was really an insight that he had in terms of what is this, what really goes into the process there. So if you want to learn more about what actually goes into the admissions process, you can certainly, search that book, Who Gets In and Why. I know it was a New York Times bestseller. Yes, Jeffrey Salingo. I'm also a podcast junkie. He has a podcast called Future You, where he talks a lot about, some hot topics, within higher education and what's going to happen next. So, all right. Why I feel race in admissions matters. And so I go back to a quote from W.B. Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk, where he says, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. We're still having this argument, today in 2023. And in the Harvard case specifically, there's an example where Justice Roberts is having sort of a banter with the lawyer for Harvard. And he's noted as stating that we didn't go to the Civil War. Well, the person's given an example in terms of saying that he was equating an oboe player with race, and to say that these are really similar. And Justice Roberts says that we didn't have a civil war over someone playing an oboe. We had a civil war over race. So this has historically been a conversation, and it matters because in this country, race matters. And so here's a quote here from a student at UNC Chapel Hill that says, "We need to have race be a factor in our admission system because race is a factor in people's everyday lives. Race is a factor in my life all the time. There is never a time when race is not a factor for me." The student was a senior. This article is from 2022. Perhaps she's graduated. It's also important because it is proven to aid colleges and universities to achieve diverse student bodies. There's research after research that shows that consideration of race and admissions helps the universities to achieve that. And then lastly, it supports the missions and values that universities and colleges have. And you see this quote here from the chancellor at UNC at Chapel Hill that says, "We are standing behind our holistic admissions process. This case is really about us defending the values of this institution and that hundreds of other universities across the country." So it's important to the mission and values that each specific institution has actually set. More importantly, a lot of the accreditation boards encourage and require a diverse student body. But we know that those accreditations are under attack right now with lots of different people, more specifically Florida. So it's not just me who believes that, race and admissions matters. In briefs, for this case, there have been specific organizations that are very closely tied to higher education, the ACT Incorporated, the College Board, which is the SAT and also AP, the National Association for College Admission Counseling, and the American Association of College Registrars and Admissions Officers all believe that this is important. I'll just read the top here. "Adopting the petitioner's view would throw admissions decision-making in American higher education into upheaval. Petitioner wants to morph the process into a mechanical procedure in which test scores and grades alone, or as the dominant measures, define applicants' merit, in contrast to the thorough, holistic review in which admissions officers currently engage." You saw what some of those factors were, all right, in terms of that holistic review. So what these organizations are saying is that this is going to change the landscape significantly and that they support continuing with race in the admissions process. Again, not just me, not just these organizations. There was a recent AP and NORC Center for Public Affairs poll just in May of 2023, where, for those of you who can't see this, I'll read the question on the first box here. The question is, "The U.S. Supreme Court is weighing whether colleges and universities can consider race and ethnicity as part of their admissions decision, a practice commonly known as affirmative action. Do you think the Supreme Court should or should not prohibit the consideration of race and ethnicity in admissions?" You see here, 63% of this poll said that they should not prohibit race in admissions. There's also the breakdown there in terms of their college degree. No college was 65%, and also college degree was 58%. So the majority of this respondents say that they should consider it. On the right side here, it talks more about, the question is, how important should each of the following be when colleges and universities make decisions about admitting students? The top there was high school grades. I agree with that. High school grades is very important. You also see standardized test scores and the ability to afford tuition, all right, at 34%, those top three there. There's lots of conversations that we can have around specific communities when it comes to test scores, when it comes to grades, when it also comes to the type of schools that a lot of these applicants are coming from. There are vast conversations that we can have there where there are lots of inequities there. But as you see here, while people agree that they should not prohibit it, according to this, 68% say not at all or not too important. All right. So, but they don't say that it should not, be considered there. So, all right. There also have been states throughout the country that have also banned race in admissions. We all know or should be aware of the, I would say, famous Prop 209 in California in 1996, Washington State in 1998, Florida in 1999, Michigan in 2006, and so forth. most recently Idaho in 2020. Again, data after data can show that where California and Michigan specifically, the number of Black and Hispanic students, more so Black students in the University of California system, where those numbers have dropped dramatically and how they're still recovering from that. And things that they've had to do, strategies that they've had to take to raise those numbers or get them back to where they were and or where the state or those universities feel that they actually should be. So, all right. So I have about a 10-minute video here that talks about the educational benefits of a diverse student body. That is from one of our professors, Dr. Ebony White.
Okay, so I want to preface my answer with another comment because I believe that context is important. And so I think it's really important for us to look at the messenger when we are examining our responses to this question, right? And so Clarence Thomas is someone who's benefited from the privilege of tokenism. And oftentimes what happens is when you have ascended as a marginalized person into a certain space, you feel real protective of that space and you feel like I can't let anybody else in. And so it's important to honor and acknowledge the standpoint that he's coming from when he presents that question, because he's someone that I would say has probably benefited from systems that have been in place to ensure diversity in certain spaces. So now with that said, what does a diverse university look like? For me, a diverse university is where there is a visible diversity at all levels, from students to staff to faculty to administration and leadership, right? And so that you see many different types of people and many different types of positions in a way that is equitable, right? And so for me as a counseling professional, our graduate counseling programs, most of them are kind of guided by CACREP standards, which is an accreditation body, and they allow programs to define diversity for themselves. And so they say programs must be diverse, however, programs get to decide what diversity means. So that means I could have a class full of white women who are different ages, and I can say this class is diverse because I have someone in here who's 55 years old, I have someone here who's 25 years old. And so I get to say that that is diversity. And so that's my problem with this language around diversity, because people can take it and make it seem like what they want it to seem like. And so visible diversity is when I'm able to look in a room, look in a space, look at a university, and I'm not talking about what they put on the website and brochures, because universities are really good at finding, oh, you're a Black person, let me put you on the website, right? I'm talking about being able to go in any space and see difference in those spaces, and then be able to have diversity of thought as well, where that's honored and supported and included. So I could probably talk about this for 6 hours straight, and so I'll try to be concise. If I start talking too much, please make sure you correct me. So why is diversity important for enrolled students? So just for the student experience, it's important to know, and I'll probably repeat this, it's important to know that we live in a global society, more so now than any other time in our history, right? It's so easy to connect to people across the pond in different spaces. And not only that, our country is diversifying, right? Every country is diversified. We have people from different backgrounds, different races, ethnicities, sexual orientations, religions, et cetera, and so on. And so for the student body experience, oftentimes, even if you live in what we consider to be a diverse state, a lot of times people grow up around people who are like them. And so, for example, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, we're on the East Coast, and we are two states that are among the most diverse in our nation. However, we're also probably in the top 5 of the most segregated states in our nation as well. And so even though, Drexel is in Philadelphia, look at the difference between the people you see inside the building and the people you see outside the building, right? You see that there is a stark difference. And so what is the problem with that? If I am only around people who look like me, who grow up like me, and then I come into a collegiate experience, I'm never getting the opportunity to engage with folks who come from different backgrounds, which means in the College of Health Professions, we're all going to be providers. There is no way in this US of A in 2023 that I'm only going to be engaging with people who look like me from backgrounds who are like me. And so if my first opportunity to engage with someone who is different from me, whether that be racially or any other way, is my client, I am definitely going to do harm. Right? I'm definitely going to do harm to them because I don't have any experiences. I'm going to treat them based off of my assumptions. I'm going to treat them based off of what I read in books. And the books are written by white people. Most of the research has been conducted on white people, right? There's a book that came out years ago, decades ago, called Even the Rat Was White. And that has done harm to communities of color who present very different with different type of mental health diagnoses, physical health diagnoses, and so on and so forth. And so if I have students in the classroom who are from diverse backgrounds, that means they have diverse perspectives. That means that they can look at the content and come at it from different angles and say, we read this, and I want to challenge that a little bit because in my family, in my community, or where I'm from, because we have a lot of students who are international students as well. That wouldn't even fly. That wouldn't be allowed in my community, right? It makes us more competent. It makes us more ethical. Right? It makes us really hold fast to that adage of doing no harm, because we know historically, particularly in the health professions, we've done a lot of harm to marginalized communities. So that learning experience is enriched when you have more diverse students in the classroom.
Great.
Well, there's a way to, so it's about being intentional about your goals and outcomes, right? There are many places in the universe that have missions, but they put revenue before their mission. They put other things before their mission. They say these things. What does it mean to live these things, right? And so not even just about seeing these applications come through, where am I doing recruitment? Right? Who am I intentionally going after saying, hey, apply for this? I'll help you, right? When I'm reading, am I reading to say, these commas not in the right place, or they didn't use the right conjunction, right? Or am I saying, I completely understand what this person is saying, right? What is my rubric? Does my rubric include punctuation and grammar and APA format? It shouldn't, right? Because that's exclusionary criteria. And so making sure that the rubric is equitable, making sure that the recruitment is intentional, right? And that means that some places are going to get hit heavier than others, right? So yes, I want to go to places, I'm going to go to more places where there are highly densely populated with people of color. Absolutely. Why do I do that? Because I have to make things equitable. Right? If I continue to do the same, like I'm gonna do 50% of my recruiting here and 50% of my recruiting here, then that means that people up here continue. This is all that's happening, right? But I have to make sure I'm trying to do this, which means more attention needs to go into certain spaces. But not just that, I'm making sure diverse people are on my board. I'm making sure diverse people are in administrative roles. I'm making sure, right? Because you want those different thoughts. Because one way that I might see a rubric, someone else might say, well, you know what? That might be problematic if you want to get Asian students. That might be problematic if you want to get indigenous students, right? And so making sure that there are many voices at the table that have a very similar vision and very similar goals. So I spoke to that. So racial diversity, what impact does it have on health equity, and why does it matter? I think it's obvious why it matters, right? And so take me, I'm a clinician, a mental health clinician. I can't tell you how many times people struggle, particularly in the Black community where there's a lot of stigma around mental health, to find a clinician that looks like them. And so what happens is, in our field, we have demonized and stigmatized Black folks to say they don't want to get better, they don't want to get help, they terminate services early. When the opposite is true. They want help, but they're tired of being helped by people who have already stigmatized them. They're tired of going to session to get help with maybe symptoms of depression and having to explain what it's like to be Black, or this terminology or that terminology, or having a code switch and not be comfortable in those spaces. And so if we're saying that we want a well society, that means we have to provide for people the provider that they want. Right? We talk about being able to choose schools, being able to choose all these things. I should be able to choose my provider. I want a female gynecologist. Why should that be difficult for me? I want a Black clinician, I want a Black therapist, right? And not only that, in some cases, because of the lack of equity work that has occurred, sometimes it's impossible to find a therapist that is Black or brown that looks like you. And so you have to go with what's there, which oftentimes are white clinicians, are white providers, right? And so having diverse student populations and faculty and diverse curriculum benefits those white providers too, because now when they're interacting with those communities, they have insights that they wouldn't have had before, right? They're more competent, right? And so yes, now I have a white provider, but I have a white provider that doesn't make me explain lingo, that doesn't make me explain, why it's difficult for me to eat off of this nutritionist guy, right? They understand because they've been exposed to it for at least 4 years in their learning, or 8 years, however, they've been exposed to it. They've been exposed to other people. They have friends, right? They have connections. They had a teacher that explained this to them. They read an article about this. And so now when I'm coming before them, I'm not just this cookie cutter person they have biases about. They have experience with people who look like me.
Okay, so that was a lot from what Dr. White was talking about. So again, I think that addressed, Clarence Thomas's, in terms of why it's important to have a diverse student population and the educational, benefits of that. For me, it's about exposure. It's about relatability. It's interesting. I had some back pain recently. I went to the physical therapist and I said something to her and she totally got it. And I know what I said was a cultural term, and for her to get it and not be, a Black person, it just meant the world to me. I'm like, you understand. And that for me, maybe she just knew a whole lot more. So I think now as we, wrap up, and certainly, we'll entertain, any questions, any thoughts, any dialogue. The question really is, what next? As we wait for this decision, which I was anticipating today, but I was pacing the hallway, but we should get it, maybe sometime this week. I think the question is, what happens next? Where do we go from here? Where do universities go? Where will Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill, go with this? But how does this impact not only the work that a lot of us do in higher education, but how might this impact affirmative action overall? How will this, what ramifications will any decision, actually have? So I'm entertaining any questions, thoughts at this point. So.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can unmute yourself and raise your hand. We have the chat here in the room. You can respond into the chat. Or you can just raise your hand and we'll call on you. Turn your camera on if you'd like to be seen. Oh, I see Dr. Carey is coming in. Oh,
yeah, she always pops in eventually. So first of all, this is an amazing topic. You're not the only meeting that was canceled for me today because there was no resolution. And there was no statement but I think the fact that we're arming ourselves in today's conversation. So your presentation dovetailing with Dr. White's presentation, it arms us now. We have language that some of us might not have had before. So I support wholeheartedly the efforts that are happening here. They're so necessary. And it's also going to be dictating what we're going to look like in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. It may not really directly impact the next 2 or 3 years, but it's definitely going to impact years subsequent to whenever this is going to be established and how it's going to be implemented and what it's going to ultimately look like and actually mean. So thank you for the comprehensiveness that you demonstrated in today's presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for your leadership, certainly as chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board here in the College of Nursing and Health Professions, Dr. Carey.
Does anyone else have any other questions? All right.
I guess I can ask a question if the room or online can hear as well.
Yeah, they can hear you.
Say we do get a decision that we don't, that kind of feels like we might be getting that race is no longer allowed within college admissions. How do we shift? I guess there's different ways that I think different universities could shift. Highly selective universities probably won't have as much of or everyone's going to want to go there. So they're not going to be able to then have financial aid. And basically, potentially, could you switch to kind of a merit-based funding mechanism that then you try to kind of make up for. You accept a larger swath of the population, but then you're giving money potentially to those individuals that you're trying to attract.
Mm-hmm.
And then it becomes a financial kind of thing versus a you're in or you're out type thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that's how colleges will start to go towards, if they're no longer allowed to consider race within the admissions process. Are they allowed to within the merit? Are they allowed to then also consider it within the merit?
From a merit scholarship standpoint?
Yeah, merit scholarship.
Well, that's a very good point. But what happens is that is a student still admissible? So what happens is, so when there's lots of research, and I've done so much, but I'm a part of this. There's one article that I read that talked about if UNC were to do that, they might have to sacrifice their standards, their admission standards. But what also is in the backdrop of all this is rankings. These schools don't want their rankings to go down. So if they, let's say, shift their review standards, their rankings might go down. There was one article I read that said that if they were to maybe continue not using the test, the SAT or test scores, it could drop them like 20 points in terms of, or 20 spots in terms of rankings. They've always, been very high up, maybe in the top 10, of public institutions and rankings. These schools may not want to, really do that. And there are lots of arguments that really shift around merit-based. But if we go back to, let's say, the University of Maryland, what they consider in the admissions process, one of the top things is, not only grades, but it's also the types of courses you took at your school. I'm still new to Philadelphia, I would say. So I'm still learning where, about the areas in the community. But if you have a more affluent area in the city or in the area, they're going to probably offer more AP scores, tests, IB, compared to another school that may not offer that many. If you're comparing those students off of merit, and we want you to take the most rigorous course load at your school, this is again where when you get into the weeds of admissions review, what they're looking at also is what's called a high school profile. So if I'm comparing a high school in an affluent area or somewhere versus a high school from my area in North Carolina, when I was in school, one AP course, I would not stack up or compete very well against that student from another area, a more well-resourced area, I would say. So I think these are conversations that, will have to continue to happen in terms of what happens, with that. But also I think the question is, what are universities, and this is probably a strong phrase, willing to sacrifice to achieve what they deem are diverse student populations on their specific campuses. So, yeah.
Can I ask you a question,
Sure.
Darius? Based on the slide that you presented that showed the states that have banned admissions from their processes, what did California do in when they were no longer able to incorporate race as a part of their admissions process? And as you mentioned, I think it wasn't particularly successful because they're still struggling to get back to where they were in terms of enrollment. What did they do? What are those states that don't allow admissions or race as a part of their admissions profile?
It required and still requires lots of creativity. What they had to do was really goes back to what Dr. White said. They had to be very intentional in terms of where they were recruiting. But a part of this also is, if you want those students to come to that specific university, how are you also shaping in terms of preparing them, for, that. So I think it was number one, their intentional recruitment efforts, going into the specific communities that they may not have gone into, before, but also helping to shape. And this is really where the conversation of, how do higher ed and K through 12 play a role with each other? That's why I say this is much more, broader conversations there. But they were intentional with their recruitment efforts, but then also played a large role in terms of preparing those, applicants to be successful, to apply to those specific, institutions. And so, and again, we're talking about more selective public universities in these specific states. So we really are looking at UC Berkeley, maybe UCLA, but then also in Michigan, the University of Michigan as well. So, yep. I think there was a question from, was it Flossie that asked the question in terms of, can you give an example of that?
Yes.
Oh, okay. There are lots of things that, again, I'm still new to the role, but things that we have planned throughout the summer. We're doing sessions specifically for, students that are in the pipeline, students of color that have identified their race in the admissions process, on their application. And again, remember, when students, in the backdrop of all this, especially the UNC case, when students apply, they're not required to check the box and say what their race is. So for students who do identify, so we have, sessions planned from CNHP going forward, in addition to, sessions for all students, but we're targeting specific, populations as well, students of color, but also first generation students, international students as well. So populations that we deem are important. And I think that's the case also for the university overall, in terms of getting those populations on campus. And I know that there have been conversations at Drexel with various offices in terms of how to prepare for this. But I think it really goes back to what Dr. White mentioned in her chat there, is that we have to be very intentional about, what we do and who we seek to attract to our campuses and to our schools.
All right. Well, if there are no further questions, again, let's thank Darius for a really excellent presentation. Thank you, Darius.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
And we will see you all next time on Tuesday Topics.
If it's Tuesday,
it's time for Tuesday Topics. That's right.
Thank you.